Hello, my name is Anne Schwenkenbecher. I'm the Academic Chair of Philosophy here at Murdoch University. We're here today at Murdoch University's Media Arts Centre talking to Krushil Watene, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Auckland University in New Zealand, where she specialises in moral and political philosophy. Welcome, Krushil, to this conversation.
Kia ora, Anne. Thanks for having me.
Krushil, in your work, in moral and political philosophy, you often talk about the Māori concept of whakapapa. Now, can you explain this concept to us and tell us how it can help us understand and maybe rethink the relationship between humans and flora, fauna, and natural entities?
Yeah, sure. So the way I think about whakapapa is I think about the sense in which for Māori philosophy, but other Indigenous philosophies too, the starting point tends to be this idea that relationships really matter, relationships with people and to places. And so whakapapa is really the term and the idea or the concept that describes this idea that we're all part of a complex system of relationships that includes people, nature, mountains, rivers, forested areas, flora and fauna, that we're all part of this system together, and that somehow those relationships really matter. The health of those relationships determine whether our lives go well or not. And we can figure out how to relate well within that system, and that we might all have responsibilities for trying to figure out how to do that well, so that we can achieve things like well-being and flourishing.
How do we know in this complex of relationships between all these different things, humans, animals, flora, natural entities, how do we know what our responsibilities are towards these other entities, and do they have responsibilities towards us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we're dealing with when we're thinking about Māori and other Indigenous philosophies is what we tend to call a place-based philosophy. Philosophies which some Indigenous thinkers will say, like Brian Burkhart, that ideas are grown from the land or grown from the waterways or are revealed to us through nature. So it's this kind of really intimate relationship that we have with these entities. So the first question is, what kind of connection enables us to answer those kinds of questions? What kind of connection to places do we need to have to be able to situate ourselves in a way that we can understand the health of an ecosystem, for instance? And practitioners are really useful here. Local community practitioners who engage with the environment, who walk the land, who understand kind of the seasons and the way in which changes happen over time, can tell you about the way in which things ebb and flow, well-being ebbs and flows, and the way in which our behaviour, which is really what negotiating relationships with nature is about, trying to figure out human behaviour, the correct kind of human behaviour, how that impacts on the natural environment and different kinds of entities, natural entities, and how changes in our behaviour can either diminish or enable that flourishing within nature. So it's really a question about us, actually.
And so I'm wondering, how do we establish, I mean, you already pointed to it, how do we establish what needs to be done? You always said it depends on an existing relationship with the place, and it depends on whether there are people who have a deep understanding of the place. Do you think this produces a great challenge when we look at places, natural environments that have been really heavily modified, or where perhaps the people who live there don't have that kind of connection? What do we do then?
This is not just a question, I think, for kind of urban, kind of modern cities, which I think you're describing, built environments, but also even our local communities where disconnection occurs too because of an ever-growing diaspora. So the question of how it is that we somehow build pathways back to relating to nature in ways that might enable us to kind of be more attuned to our relationships with it. That's one of the challenges I think that we have, and I think lots of cities are trying to figure that out by creating more green spaces, by encouraging us to get outside, by encouraging us to kind of cycle, and to care more about, just basic things like gardening, right? Understanding that, the way in which we interact with our gardens makes a difference to whether those plants can flourish, just basic things like that. But yes, it's one of the biggest challenges that I think we face for trying to figure out how to live better lives together with the natural environment is to reconnect with it somehow.
I'm quite curious, you mentioned community leaders. What role do you see Western science to play in this? Does it help us? Does it hinder us from establishing that kind of connection? Is the approach complementary? This is a big question, I'm aware, but how do we bring these types of knowledge together, these different types of scientific and community-based Indigenous and traditional knowledges?
Great question. So lots of communities, Indigenous communities and other local communities are already kind of grappling with these questions, and they have for quite some time. A really interesting way of thinking about this that Kyle White pioneered a long time ago was to think about what he called traditional ecological knowledge, which we find in the sciences, to say, well, what we're dealing with is a collaborative concept. That's the best way to think about this idea, as trying to enable collaboration across different cultures and different situations, including disciplines. And science is an important part of that. One important part of that. And we see this in some of my communities where we're restoring waterways with scientists, where we're building our own scientists within the communities, where we're restoring things like inanga, what we call whitebait in New Zealand, just to figure out how we would say, live better with all of our relatives, right? In a changing social and political climate too, right?
So one of the key elements here is just to take a wider range of beings into account when we make decisions. Is that roughly right? At the same time, to just think of our responsibilities as being broader ranging and perhaps not as narrow as we sometimes tend to construe them, and also in Western moral philosophy, where we think of responsibilities often a bit more narrowly, I think. Yes. Is there ever a chance that our responsibilities towards the natural environment, our non-human animals, or places, that they can conflict, that we're kind of torn between, should we promote the well-being of this species over this other species, for instance? Are there conflicts of relationships and responsibilities possible in this within this concept of whakapapa, and how would we administer them, or how would we deal with them?
Great. Yes, often. I mean, once you grant, as you've said, that the scope of our relationships is incredibly inclusive and wide, then part of managing what we might call conflicts, often tragic conflicts and tragic choices, just becomes part of what it means to kind of figure out how to live together. Right. So often in sort of moral philosophy, we try to limit the conflicts. We try to say, right, a good theory can kind of figure out ways in which we don't have to have the conflict, or gives us a principle that really gives us a hard line as to what we should do when we have a conflict. And so that kind of really limits the nature of the number of conflicts that might arise. That's one of the ways we can do it. But when we're thinking about Indigenous philosophies and Māori philosophy in particular with whakapapa, we just grant that there's a whole range of things that we have to do. Often those conflicts are tragic. Sometimes we have to reflect on the way in which society is organized creates those conflicts, right? And we have to fix that. And other times we have to make a hard decision, like an introduced species versus a native species. We have to figure out how we can interact in a way that can still honor those species, even though they're introduced, right? That can still honor that they have value in their own right, even if it means that we have to try and eradicate it some way. And perhaps we also have to restore relationships later because we have to make tough choices now. So it's this kind of evolving relationship that happens. And so we kind of have to grapple with not just grapple with, but accept the way in which tragic choices will occur.
So it's also, in a way then, bidding farewell to the idea that we can have answers to a lot of these moral questions and environmental questions that are basically set in stone. You're saying we're not trying to find the one answer that will tell us forever what is the right thing to do. It's just within the environment which is changing, our responses, our reactions need to be changing, and this can't be done on the basis of some abstract principle. It's done on the basis of communication, working together, and as you said, it's basically based on the relationships we have within the community, and the community largely very broadly construed, like including natural entities.
Absolutely. It also, I think, gives us this really exciting way of thinking about philosophy, which you've just wonderfully explained, which is that philosophy is experienced and lived in the world too, right? And trying to figure out what that means for the kinds of ideas that we might generate and the kinds of practices that we might generate gives us a different pathway to thinking about philosophy too.
So it brings philosophy back into the
the
lived world and
Yes.
into the real world. And that's, I'm very much on board with that. I do think philosophy, when it's too removed from practical questions, it stops being relevant. I'm particularly interested in one of the concepts that have been used in a legal context. Actually, I'm interested in some of the philosophical underpinnings of the Te Urewera Act of 2014, which you discuss in your article that was shortlisted for the Annette Beyer Prize, where you speak of this case of granting legal rights to natural entities. Can you just tell me a bit, what's the thinking behind the granting of legal rights, and how does that work in practice to grant legal rights to, say, a forest or a river system?
The interesting thing about Te Urewera, which is the name of the forested area, was it already had the highest level of protection in New Zealand, right? It was a national park, but it was part of a treaty settlement by the people of that area, the Tūhoe people, where it was a really important part of their settlement package, right? The reconciliation process of reconnecting with that place, being able to learn about that place once more, being able to be guardians of that place. And so part of that was to rethink the way in which the law could enable that kind of relationship building once again. And the way in which that was decided was to say that they would treat Te Urewera as a legal person with its own value and dignity, and if you want to say rights too, that would be protected by a group of representatives, but also the community too, and that it would be protected forever, not just for the kaitiaki or the guardians of that place, the Tūhoe people, but for all New Zealanders, because of the way in which it inspires us to take care of it, and the way in which it inspires us to relate to it in really meaningful ways, and it enriches our lives. So it kind of places a real sense of kind of meaning on a place in its own right, that says, if we look after that place, if we enact practices of care that we know are important for ensuring that that place is protected, then it actually enriches our own lives, right? It enriches the life of our nation, it enriches the life of the local communities, but also enriches the lives of all the communities in New Zealand, Māori and otherwise. So it gives real power to nature, I think.
And how would nature be able to exercise that power? I'm curious, is the forest, for instance, can it sue if it has a legal person? How does that play out in practice?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Lots of people worry about this aspect of this idea of rights of nature, and I think it's slightly misguided because I think it kind of treats the act as not really extending this idea of rights at all, which is what's happening, I think. So if you have a look at the background to the Act, and if you have a look at what the purpose of the Act is, it's really to really stretch these concepts that we find in Western philosophy and to actually ask back and to talk back to those concepts to say, what are the limits that you're placing on the way in which we can relate to nature with the way in which we understand rights and, the law? And so often we think, well, this just doesn't make sense. It's not the kind of thing that can have a right because it's not the kind of thing that has the right kind of agency and it can't sue us. But if we think about this in a way that says it's already valuable, right? It already has rights, and those rights need to be protected by us, right? That's our responsibility, right? Then I think you get a different way of thinking about not just nature, but what the law is for, right? What environmental law is for, actually. And so I don't think it matters so much. I don't think the interesting question is whether or not the forest can sue, but the extent to which what powers and obligations in particular it gives to us as a community to pursue ends that we know are better for the forest and everything that belongs there.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah, that as you say, expanding in a way, co-opting existing concepts and say, well, you know what, we think the forest should have the status of a legal person, and certain things follow from that, and also it's perhaps partly reflective of the status it ought to have anyway, and it already has in many communities. I know there's some attempts, or it's an argument that has been made to ascribe legal personhood to the Fitzroy River system in the Kimberley in the north of Western Australia. So that would be a very interesting parallel case. Hopefully one day we'll get there as well. I'm interested in another discussion you have in the article mentioned that was shortlisted for the Annette Beyer Prize. I read that you speak about intergenerational responsibilities and the different understanding in Māori philosophy of intergenerational responsibilities versus mainstream Western philosophy. And one thing that struck me in there is that you said things like it's important to build intimacy between present and past generations. Another thing you said was that actually future generations have more power over us than we assume they do, or we tend to think they do. So could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, great. So in the paper, I mean, you're referring to what we call a whakatauki or a proverb, which is that we walk backwards into the future. And so in the paper, I'm trying to really figure out what that means and how we take that seriously, right, as a kind of philosophical starting point for thinking about intergenerational justice. What does it mean to say that we walk backwards into the future? And how does that kind of temporal orientation impact on what our responsibilities are and how they play out and how they are cashed out? And so I think that's quite unique. In Western philosophy, we tend to be forward-looking only, at the expense, I would say, of the past often. But what we find in Indigenous philosophies and Māori philosophies, but also Pacific philosophies more generally, is this orientation where often our responsibilities to the future are grounded in a responsibility to the past, in fact, to our ancestors. And so what that means is to make sense of that and to make sure that we kind of generate practices that honour that, you have to build intimacy between generations in a way that you don't find, I don't think, in Western philosophy. And so some of the examples that I use are the way in which language helps us to do that, the way in which we talk about ourselves as tangata whenua, as people of the land, the way in which when we introduce ourselves, we speak to our ancestors and bring them closer to us, the way in which when we have conversations and discussions in our whare, in our houses, often those houses are lined with images of our tupuna or our ancestors, so they're always present in our lives, always in front of us. I think that's quite unique. And I'm trying to still grapple with how that transforms the way in which we think about philosophy generally, but also intergenerational justice. One of the really interesting implications of this idea that we walk backwards into the future is that we would say that a lot of power is held by our descendants, because part of the way in which we would measure our own lives today would be on the lives that we enable them to live in the future. But also more than that, we know that just as our ancestors did, we hope for a world that we won't live to see ourselves, a flourishing environment, protected areas all around our communities, a thriving community once more with thriving languages. We know we'll never live to see that. And so, in fact, our descendants are the guardians of those hopes and aspirations too. And so a lot of the ways in which we think about justice today will depend on the way in which our descendants think about it. And so we do see that I'm not sure if power is the right word, but there's a lot of, there's a sense in which our lives depend on them, right? And what they choose to do in the future and what we enable them to do in the future.
Yeah, that's basically like saying our aspirations and whether they get realized and our ideas of what it would mean to live in a better place depend on whether future generations see it the same way and manage to improve the world. Well, we might leave it at that for today. It has been absolutely lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much.